Good morning, I'm David, and it's Sunday the 8th of November, and this is the Pisgah Sunday Weekly Reflection. And of course, if you're in the UK, it's no ordinary reflection. There's the clue. It's Remembrance Sunday. It feels very odd to be sitting here on Remembrance Sunday. Usually we'd be down at the cenotaph, and then later marching to St Mary's with the British Legion to have the joint service there. Instead, we're at home. I'm here and you're in your house. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't. And it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't remember. We need to remember. Not as a celebration of war, but because we need to remember as a way of honouring and thanking those people who gave their lives in the pursuit of peace. But also it's important to remember that war is awful. And if we remember that, then it spurs us on, it helps us to do what we can in our own little ways to promote peace in our relationships, in our world, in whatever way we can. There's a separate link that you can click on. It's on Facebook and it's on the email I sent out to the Remembrance prayer that I'm sharing with the virtual British Legion service later today. But if you want to listen to that prayer and pray along with it, and have that minute silence, then by all means click on that link. But we're going to move on now with our Bible reflection. It's based on John 14, 22 to 29. If you want to read that now, then just press pause. Now, I've confessed recently that I love stories. I'm a bit of a magpie for personal stories. I'm professionally nosy. It's useful. Being both a psychiatric nurse and a pastor, I get to hear people's stories, both the nice ones and the sad ones. But they're all very valuable in their own way. It's a real privilege to hear them. And at this time of year, in Remembrance, there's an abundance of anecdotes and stories. In the newspapers, on the telly, I find in my pastoral visits, that people's memories are kindled, especially the much older folks. And you hear some fascinating stories of life in Cresswell, Quay, all around here during the war, what it was like in the airfield with the GIs coming into the community. Absolutely fascinating. But of all the war stories I've ever heard, the most powerful remains the one told me by my wife Emma's grandma, Sadie. I mentioned this a couple of years ago in St Mary's Church. But Sadie, to me, she was this gentle lady. I'd known her a few years at that point. Softly spoken Scots lady, gentle, peaceful, lovely and kind. It's really hard to imagine that she'd ever had bad times in her life because she was just so peaceful. And yet one day we were driving to Landaloy. I happened to ask her something about her past. And she mentioned this in a way that's completely devoid of self-pity. But she lost both her parents in the wars. Lost her father in the First World War. He died aboard his ship that was sunk, and she never got to meet him. And then she lost her mum in the Second World War. Her mum died next to Sadie. They were in the wreckage of a little Anderson shelter in the bottom of a garden during the Blitz in London, and her mum practically died in her arms. She bled out. And for me, that brought home some of the reality of war. It wasn't just something that happened in the old days. It wasn't just a historical thing. This was real. It happened in living memory. And not so long ago, the world was ripped apart and turned upside down. And for somebody who's grown up in peacetime, it was quite a revelation, a helpful revelation. I was reminded of Sadie's story when I read another story recently. This was a story recounted which I read about by an elderly gentleman, a story of a story. He said he was a public school boy in the 1940s in a very posh public school. And there was a much beloved master who was giving this lesson. This was a master who'd been at the school for decades. All the kids loved him. He'd committed decades of teaching and nurturing to bring on these young lives. It was what he lived for. He was giving a history lesson on Waterloo, and he recounted the famous words that Wellington shouted, the order he shouted, "Up guards an atom." Now this spurred the British on. They pushed back the French. The British had been on the defensive all day, suddenly pushed forward. The French went back into the arms of the Prussians who had just entered the battlefield. And so the battle was won. And as the teacher announced that, one of the boys stood up and said, "Hurrah!" I said it was a very posh school. But what really surprised the whole class was that their rosy-cheeked, friendly master suddenly lost all colour. He was shaking with rage. "Who said that?" he said in a cold, uncharacteristic voice. Well, the boy admitted it was him. And the teacher took a moment or two just to bring his emotions in check, apologised to the boy for snapping, asked him to sit down. And then he went on a diatribe, something that in the 1940s wasn't just controversial, it was probably career suicide. He said that war was filth. And he described the current war as filth. Filth created by self-serving, ruthless, power-crazed politicians. And he said that the soldiers, the lads who went out there, were the cleaners who were there to clean up the mess that other powerful people had made. Finally, the teacher said in a very quiet tone, "To say that it is a sweet and fitting thing to die for your country is just propaganda intended to produce more cannon fodder. If this lunacy continues, and if you get caught up in the war," he said to the boys, "I pray that you hold on to your humanity." Well, you probably won't be surprised to hear the old man recounting a tale said many of his classmates started to grumble. There was an air of discontent in the classroom. He may be a beloved master, but nobody could speak like this. This was treacherous talk. But even the grumbling was stopped in its tracks when the master started to walk around the room. He described how he'd committed so many years into teaching and how it was all going up literally in smoke. He pointed to one desk that a lad was sitting at and he said, 8 years ago, young Nigel Coggins, or whoever he was, sat at that desk. He described his character, his sporting achievements, his career potential. Then he described how he was blown to pieces in whichever battlefield. Went to another desk, described that boy, his potential. At the time he played one of the most famous practical jokes ever in the school's history on the headmaster and how funny it was. And how he's now shell-shocked and legless in some hospital. And he went round more desks, pointing out the individuals, telling their stories, describing their ugly demise. The classroom was utterly quiet. And what more, that the teacher was crying, tears were running down his face. Boys and men weren't supposed to cry back then. But this man was crying freely, and it was infectious. Now, he obviously held a severe anti-war position on the pole. And whether or not you agree with him, you probably sympathise with how he came to that view, his grief for so many young lives lost. Now, the polar opposite, I suppose, would be something more hawkish, more pro-war. Some people would describe those pro-war types as patriotic. But as the writer of this story pointed out, his master wasn't unpatriotic. He was a patriot, but he was also a pacifist. I guess most of us listening to that story now would fall somewhere between the two poles. I'm discovering that the older I get, the less black and white the world becomes for me. I look at two of my Christian heroes, for instance, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King. They both faced their evil in different circumstances, in very different ways. Bonhoeffer, he was a World War II theologian. He's written some of the most amazing spiritual books I've ever read. They've certainly shaped my understanding and my theology in huge ways. He was a man who stood against the Nazis. He became a martyr. He was a pacifist. At the core of his theology was pacifism. He saw pacifism in the cross of Jesus. And yet he felt he had to put aside his pacifism to join the plot to kill Hitler. But then there was Martin Luther King, who faced his own violence and prejudice that was aimed at him. He faced that with peaceful protest. Now, were both men right for their time, for their generation? Or was one man more right than the other? And can we judge? It's also true that not all wars are the same. Often historians will talk about the First World War and say it was eminently avoidable, that it was the extreme nationalism on behalf of the aristocrats in both Germany and Britain that pushed the continent and the whole world to war. Although the Second World War, many people would say there was a more discernible evil, something to be resisted. It was perhaps a justifiable war, if any war can be justified. And then we come to today's wars. Don't get me started there. I look at some of the conflicts in the last couple of decades, say, and I don't know where the humanitarian cause starts and commercial interests end. They seem to overlap each other. And you look at some of the dictators, and then you think, well, how did they get there? And often they were put there by the West, who are now enemies of the West. Whatever our position is, morally, philosophically, on war this morning, whichever war, we can't get past the words of Jesus in John today. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give as the world gives. We don't find much peace in the world. But my peace I give to you, Jesus said. The God we meet here is the God who commands us to pass on love, not hate. That schoolboy who wrote as an old man the story I recounted to you now, he said, although even now he's somewhat conflicted about some of the views of his master, he's not completely signed up to everything his master said. He still feels that some of the most vital lessons he's learned of his life came from that one session on Waterloo that expanded into the whole kind of war diatribe. He said he's learned that to hate is to destroy reason. And to hate one's enemies, or the nations that have been enemies, is preposterous, because aren't all nations guilty? Wasn't it Jesus who said, let those who without sin cast the first stone? We looked at the Beatitudes last week. We looked at the way that the Beatitudes turn up the world's understanding upside down. You thought it was this way. Jesus says, actually, from God's perspective, it's this way. In the Beatitudes, we heard how, yes, the world tends to go for vengeance. If you're hurt, it's your right to take vengeance, to get even. Whereas Jesus promotes forgiveness, mercy, blessed are the merciful, because we all need mercy. Mercy or forgiveness is often described as the spoke in the wheel of hate. It stops the cycle going around forever and ever. The world celebrates winners with an eye on the prize. Jesus said that God celebrates the humble and the helpful. But the most pertinent of all the statements, all of the blessings, the Beatitudes we heard last week in relation to today's theme, is the one where Jesus says, I will bless the peacemakers. He'll bless the peacemakers because xenophobia murders, nationalism taken too far kills, bigotry slaughters, racism massacres, chauvinism destroys, and we can add lots more isms to the list, I'm sure. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who build up the human spirit. They don't destroy it with hate. Whatever philosophy we hold, pro-war, anti-war, something in between, I hope we can all meet together, as it were, and observe the terrible side effects of war, mourn and remember. So let's remember those who have died. Let's remember those who have been bereaved and wounded. Let's choose to support those who come together to aid the process of peace in our world or in our communities, who fight for justice. Now, if you're a Christian listening to this, then there's an imperative put upon us that we can't ignore. Jesus was clear that the family of God isn't about borders, be they cultural, be they national, or whatever. Isn't about race or colour or creed. The family of God is just that. They're God's children. Jesus was clear that he died for everyone. He laid down his life for anyone who would choose to follow him and have faith in him. And the way we celebrate that in the Christian church most powerfully is in communion. We often call it the family time. It's like it's like coming to the family table for the Lord's Supper. And although we might go in our little churches and our little groups, spiritually speaking, we're all in this big, massive, worldwide table. In different countries, across nationalities, we're all at the same table. And as Christians, we cannot afford to come to the table disrespecting our fellow guests, holding overt prejudice, unchallenged prejudice against our guests, hating our guests. These are the guests, the honoured guests that our Lord Jesus has invited to his table. If we choose to hate the people who he's invited, we're hating him, we're dishonouring him. Can any of us consciously afford to do that? Can any of us allow ourselves to do that? So yes, let's remember. Remember in order to honour the dead. Remember so that we never take peace for granted. Remember which path hate can take us down. And remember so that as we come together with our brothers and sisters in communion, both those in person and those spiritually around the world, that we can do that not as hypocrites and as haters, but as genuine children of God, children who live by the statement, "Blessed are the peacemakers. My peace I give you." Let's not forget. Amen. Okay, if you want to close in prayer, then click on the other link, watch the other video, pray along with me. But for now, I just pray you have a lovely day today. I pray that your day is full of peace and good fellowship with the people around you. If you need me, please give me a ring. I've always got time to chat. So take care. Lots of love. Bye-bye.